It is a cold day on March 19th in the great state of Texas. Ryan Ray alongside Chris Fenton. Mr. Fenton, how is it out in California? It's cold and windy here in Texas. How are you doing, sir?
Well, it's warm here, and we have our electricity working, which I guess I should always ask you, how's your electricity down there? Working? All right, good. Internet's on. That's a good scene. Yeah. Today's episode, I'm glad we're both able to have electricity and talk about stuff. I don't even know where to start. Last night, I was super interested in trying to piece together what was happening in Alaska. I would have killed to be a fly on the wall up there. I'm putting my name out there as somebody that I would love to be, even somebody fetching coffee for those people up there, because I just want to be a part of the process. So I'll just put my name out there, anybody that's listening. But it was fascinating. And I was texting with a lot of better experts than me on what they were hearing. And then I was trying to follow what I thought was that were a handful of the journalists that actually were in there able to get tweets out. It sounded like there were a lot of people actually in the lobby able to get some information and get it out. I don't know if we know for sure what happened after everybody was cleared out of there. I think we're still waiting on that. I did see somebody posted that I circulated an actual feed of the full hour and I think 12 minutes of what happened in there, which was really interesting to hear. And the way it ended was definitely, I don't think, as diplomatic as maybe some doves and some, senior diplomats were hoping for. But God, what a crazy, crazy situation. So I think we definitely want to talk about that. But before we get into anything, and I know, Ryan, you're going to want to say something about this too, but violence against Asian Americans. We got to address that because we're going to talk hard on China. And I don't want us talking hard on China to relate to any sort of hatred towards Asian people. Okay. Our issue is with the government of China. That is our issue. The people of China is not what we have a problem with. Now, granted, just like in the United States, there's some bad people in China. There's bad people here. There's bad people all over the place. But I also know some very good people in China, and I'm also very good friends with a lot of people in China. So the hatred or the anger or the frustration is not against them. And it surely isn't against Asians on the whole, because let's face it, Koreans and Japanese are not the same as Chinese. In fact, they're very different people. Yes, for some reason, we label them all Asian, which I think is a big issue too. And I'm not qualified to talk about that cultural issue. But the fact is, Koreans and Japanese and people in the ASEAN countries are not Chinese for the most part. Yes, there's Chinese nationals there. There are expats from China. There's people that go back and forth that are Chinese. But they're also very different countries. It's like saying, even here in the United States of America, that somebody in Birmingham, Alabama is exactly like somebody in San Francisco, California. That is not the case. And that's actually in our own nation. Now try talking about different nations and grouping them all together. So anyway, hatred, any sort of violence, harassment towards Asians is not tolerated by this show. And we are not tying together anything that's happening there with our stance on what we need to do moving forward with China and Chinese government issues.
Yeah, and I would just say, just as a professing libertarian, one of the core principles of libertarianism is the non-aggression principle, which means you just don't go get to take people's stuff. You don't get to act of violence. And so when you hear my criticisms of the government or of people, it's from a non-aggression principle standpoint. And so I try to apply that consistently, whether it's the government in an unjust war, our government or theirs, or people. So as a libertarian, the non-aggression principle is the core foundation for what we operate off of. So yes, and so the words and how we're trying to do these arguments is you're right. Another thing I'll add is I talk about Africa quite often, and I always feel bad. I always say, okay, in Africa, and I'll say, well, okay, I'm saying Africa, but I'm being very general because Africa is a very diverse place. Even in those countries, you have 10, 12, 13, 15 different dialects and people groups. So it's a great reminder that when we're talking about these things, we try to do 35 minutes on the show. Behind the scenes, we're doing 35 minutes. I'm looking at the clock. I'm like, hey, Chris, anything else? That means we're close to 35 minutes. We can't stop and say, okay, hey, this is what we're talking about. We just can't. So yes, a great reminder. When we're talking, we're trying to talk very high level, try to not have to nuance everything, But non-aggression principle means you just don't aggress on people for no reason. And all of this stuff that you're referring to would definitely fall into that category. And most of the violence in the world would fall under the non-aggression principle. So if we all just followed that, things would be a lot better.
Yeah. And by the way, to add to that, the one thing we don't want is like, it's hard enough to rally support on red and blue and everybody inside the business community and everybody inside our leadership of this country and the populace together on a common cause, like tackling the challenge that the Chinese Communist Party and China are creating for the Americans, right? For America and our Western alliance. We need to unite on that. And if we start getting pulled into the space that, you know, this challenge is tied to the other challenge, which it is not, we're going to muddy the water and it's going to weaken our ability to unite on this front. Now, the second thing is I'm going to say, and I don't have any proof of it, but I'm going to go by case study history, is that anytime there are issues in the United States of America that are relatively public and they make us look bad or make us look divided, you can guarantee the Chinese Communist Party is throwing gasoline on that flame. So I wouldn't be surprised that some of what happened this week is starting to get intensified by various operatives within the Ministry of Propaganda, because I know it's happening on the ground in China. China is talking a lot about the divided nature of the United States and some of the key incidents that have been occurring recently that have played into that. So you can guarantee if they're doing that with their own populace, they're spreading that message around the world somehow. So once again, violence, harassment, any sort of hatred towards Asian Americans, not tolerated. So now let's talk about Alaska.
Yeah, and that does not mean robust discussions where we disagree, because Chris and I both are proponents of those, and so that we welcome the debate. Okay, it was kind of a timely moment. You are a film guy, you're a Hollywood guy, you like to build these pictures and stories. We have the release of the Snyder Cut on the same night that the U.S. and China meet up in Alaska. And on some level, okay, well, the Snyder Cut obviously goes one way with the Justice League, a lot more fighting involved. But the verbal sparring that we got in Alaska felt almost Justice League-esque. And I called this the other day. I said, China has a swagger. And I think we have to realize as Americans that they're walking around the swagger. They're going to say things. And so here's how you got to categorize them. A few weeks ago, they invited the UN to come look at the Uyghur situation. We didn't take them up on that. Now they're sitting here saying, well, U.S., you do this, and you do this, and you do this. And some of those things they are right about. Americans have to realize they are right about some of the accusations they levy. Some of the things, as you point out, they take and they're propagandize, right? They inflame them. They make it, they blow out of proportion. They say, well, you have this problem. Don't talk about our problem over here. Well, it's in a lot of cases, their problem is far worse. But they have a swagger in the U.S. side of the equation. I'll just tell you, just from talking to people internationally, a lot of people feel like the U.S. has had that swagger for some time. And so China is just mirroring what we're seeing in these talks with what the U.S. has done. And so the U.S. has to figure out how to combat that tone. From my standpoint, Chris, the best way to do it is to not give them the ammunition. So they talk about us spying around the world. They're right. They talk about us overthrowing governments. They're right. All those things are right. So either you get to justify morally why those things are right and they're different, or you're just going to go back and forth, tit for tat, and they're going to have the ammunition. So I'll let you respond, but I thought it was fascinating how they came out swinging for the Chinese side, and they held no punches, it seemed like.
Look, they're a formidable competitor, and if we look at it in a way that I think we should, which is they're an intense competitor playing at a great level of play. I mean, we can argue about that. If we actually step up with the resolve and the fortitude that this country is capable of, we're going to rise above them and play better than them. It's like playing a very good team in whatever sport. They make you rise to the occasion and surpass what you're capable of, or you just lay down your guns and you walk away. One of the two. That is our decision to make. And I will say that they do their research. Now, I'm a fan of Blinken and a fan of Sullivan, and I think they really know what they're talking about. But at the same token, it did seem like China did their diligence. We've talked about how they put Chinese Communist Party members here on the ground in exchanges to learn about the ways and the thinking and how people operate here in this country. They put a lot of study and effort into knowing us well. That's the art of war. They're very good at that. And they're very good and capable of learning over long periods of time. We seem to have more of a hegemony, hubris outlook on things, like it's our way at the highway. And sometimes we don't put our research into things. Now, I'm not saying that's what happened in Alaska, but I would say if I'm Monday morning quarterbacking as a lesser expert than the ones that were up there in Alaska, I would say one thing we did just in a macro sense with China is we backed them in a corner like a raccoon in a way. And the reason I say that is that I think in hindsight, I would have rather seen us not go to Alaska after we met with the regional allies in that area and talked tough with them and looked like we were ganging up on China, and instead did that post the Alaska meeting, because we really ruffled a lot of feathers in China by having those conversations with the regional allies and sort of the tough talk that came out of there. So they went in there with a very different disposition than they would have if we just came in clean and then followed up with regional allies. So that's one thing that I haven't seen people talk about, but I just think about it in terms of some of the business negotiations and things that I dealt with over 20 years. And that might be a macro idea that in hindsight, I would have thought maybe we should have changed.
Well, so you're talking about the Quad meeting, right? Yeah. So the Quad meeting, I got a little different read on that, because I thought the Quad meeting placated to China quite nicely. If you read the joint statement, it never mentions China's name one time. It talks about what they're going to do and how they're going to work this out. But the China comes up is in the South China Sea. That's the only time it comes up. And so the official joint statement, unless I missed another statement they issued, doesn't talk about China. And so even if you go back and looking at the press secretary's comments before the Quad meeting, she didn't mention China. She talked about climate change, economic stability, COVID-19 vaccinations. And so I thought the U.S. tried to downplay China and what they're doing with China with the Quad meeting. Did I miss something, or why is your read different on that than mine?
I don't think you have to say anything. I think it's just simply the symbolism of having those meetings and showing that there's a building of an alliance that obviously is going to be used against China's rise. There's no doubt. I mean, you can't hide that. We're not over there because we're afraid that, I don't know, Laos is going to take over that region. I mean, it's diligent, it's obvious. And I think when you think about the insecurity of the Chinese Communist parties in certain ways, it plays right into it and puts things on the wrong narrative. And then on top of it, because they do study us and they know what pushes our buttons, I think in a way, what happened in Atlanta that plays into the civil unrest and the civil discourse that's happening here in the country played into their "you're terrible United States when it comes to minorities and human rights yourselves," or whatever it was. And then we're not too far removed from January 6th of this year. I think on top of it, we showed a lot of ambiguity and sort of a hypocrisy in the way we just recently dealt with MBS and the Khashoggi situation with Saudi Arabia. I think also on top of that, we did launch a strike in the Middle East not all that long ago. So there was a lot of good fodder for China to say, hey, have you guys looked in the mirror at all lately? You're being a little hypocritical here. And then on top of that, we created a face issue and an insecurity issue by meeting with allies prior to that meeting. It really put things on an unstable footing for us.
Okay, so I'll concede the point that they were frustrated because we had the meeting. If that's the case, then let's separate these issues. If having the meeting is offensive, then you have to just come to the realization that, you're going to try to tiptoe around these issues. It's just not going to work, because I thought they were pretty soft in their comments about this whole thing. Now, if you go across the pond, if you, as I like to say, and you read some of the news commentary there, they were building it up as more of a China type Quad meeting. The U.S. side did not seem to do that. So maybe they were responding, reading some of those news reports as well. But if you can't have a meeting and it's going to offend them, then I think that you have to come out and say what you're going to say, not try to hide it, because it didn't do you any good. So if I can just concede your point, then it didn't do us any good to avoid it from the U.S. standpoint. And why are we tiptoeing around these issues if they're going to get pissed off regardless?
I think that's 100% the case. I mean, just keep in mind, there's a lot of symbolism thrown around, and there's a lot of nuance that's gathered in certain ways by one side of the Pacific versus the other. So we just got to be cognizant of that. And in the same boat, I would also say, like, the commentary here on what happened in Alaska just shows once again how divisive we are as a country. I mean, I was trying to post out different commentary from both the left and the right, and trying to balance it. It actually seemed like the right was following Alaska a lot closer and being a lot more critical and actually being very vocal about it. It seemed like the left was a lot quieter about it, mainly because it probably wasn't going all that well. But I will say, I'm still cautiously optimistic about who President Biden has surrounded himself with in regards to engaging China. I'm also optimistic that we didn't just go up there and kowtow and say, hey, let's put things back the way they were. Whether it went awry or not, and I guess we're going to find out more today about what happened behind closed doors. We just need to unify on this. Like, China should be the great unifier of left and right. And just reading the commentary, posting it out there, and I'm sure I'm going to get ridiculed by friends of mine on the left for saying, why'd you put out, so-and-so's commentary on it? Or somebody on the right's gonna be like, why'd you put out the New York Times on it, or whatever it was. Like, I was just trying to show both sides, but I would love to see that commentary sort of get together. And quite frankly, from what we were hearing last night, the commentary probably should have been like, oh, we might have done things a little off timing. I wish we were a little more prepared, blah, blah, blah. But I'm glad they stayed tough on it. I'm glad they at least had this meeting. Now let's regroup and figure out what the next best course of action, whatever it is, instead of just everybody piling on.
Yeah. So a couple things here. Just I think I've told this on the show. I don't know if I have or not. But I met with a former CIA agent one time who dealt with China, and the context of Snowden came up, and we're talking about Huawei. He's talking about how it's a big threat. And the context of Snowden came up. And his response wasn't, Snowden revealed a bunch of stuff that was really sad. His response was, Snowden cost us years of ability to be able to spy on people, is a loose paraphrase of what he said. And we're like, well, why are you mad at China for what you're accusing them with Huawei? And he goes, well, it's different. And so from China's standpoint, they know all of this stuff. And so when they're talking about Syria or this or that, that's what they're talking about. Like, the U.S. believes that it was right to spy on its own citizens internationally and not tell anyone. Well, what's different? Let's assuming Huawei is doing that. What's the difference? And the U.S. has to make the moral case. As a libertarian, I don't think that's right for either side to be doing, just so we're clear. The other thing I thought was interesting is if you looked at the time, I can't remember who tweeted this out. They were supposed to have like a 3-minute speech, 3-minute speech, 3-minute speech, 3-minute speech, and then dismiss or something like that. And China took, I think, 16 minutes. One of their people in their opening speeches. Did you see that? Because I thought that was interesting that they came prepared to really kind of have the bully pulpit.
Well, first of all, if you ever sat in any sort of a meeting or a banquet where the mic is passed to somebody on the China side, you can pretty much guarantee they're going to go at least 2x over what their allotted amount is, and probably a lot more than that. So that wasn't shocking to me whatsoever. In fact, that they kept them limited to, I think it was 16 minutes or whatever, I thought was quite an accomplishment. So look, they came out like cornered raccoons. They felt like they were getting ganged up upon over the past few days. And on top of it, they felt like they had great research and a great rebuttal and a great sort of look in the mirror argument to make to the United States to say, hey, don't tell us what to do. We're on the rise. We're a superpower. You better pay attention. The whole thing is fascinating. I'm really curious to see what happened behind closed doors, which we'll hear a little more today. And I hope it went a little better than what we know right now.
I'm glad you brought that up, because part of this is posturing for news clips as well. So the U.S. is coming out saying very strong words. China saying very strong words. China said that, I can't remember, I don't want to misquote them, but essentially, we don't respect the U.S.'s position anymore. Well, that's not entirely true. And we know that because how they've handled trade. So they've cracked down on trade with Australia orders of magnitude harder than they have the U.S. And so even the worst points with the Trump administration last year, they was cutting off Australia, and they were still buying for the U.S. And if you go back and remember, Trump was blaming coronavirus on the Chinese, letting it out, creating it, all this stuff. That never, it probably influenced some trade aspects. But Australia said, hey, we don't really think that. We just want to know what happened. So can we get an investigation? We're like, we're done with you guys. So for all that bravado that you did see yesterday, there is still probably behind closed doors going to be a lot more of hey, we're going to kind of be a little bit softer. I do have one question. Does Blinken remind you of the president from House of Cards, Garrett Walker or whatever his name was? Not Underwood, but the one that Underwood overtook.
Huh. I never thought about that. That's interesting. I got to take another look. And
I was watching his comments today. I was like, oh, it looks like Walker. Anyways, go ahead. Sorry.
By the way, the other thing that I find peculiar today is that, I mean, I don't know if you remember in 2019, every time something blew up between the US and China, the stock markets fell 1,000 points or whatever it was. I mean, what happened last night clearly shows that we're not going back to the way it used to be. And in fact, it might get much more intense and much more difficult to pull off the same kind of business, opportunities and activities that we have been. The fact that the markets haven't essentially shrugged it off is really interesting to me. I'm not exactly sure how to digest that, or whether it's just because the news cycle really hasn't covered it as intensively as they did when it was Donald Trump doing it. And I will add to that it seemed to me that there were only 3 journalists from the U.S. that were allowed access into the meeting, and they were 3 journalists that I hadn't come across before. I started reading some of their Twitter, posts, and I thought they were all pretty interesting. But I wonder if it's because no one really cared about what was going on up there. I mean, for me, I'm in this bubble where I'm like, this is one of the biggest events that's happening geopolitically today. And I was on conference calls or whatever with other business going on, but I was following what was happening in real time because I thought it was as big as it gets. I wonder if people were just more interested to see if UCLA or Michigan State won last night, or watch Zach Schneider.
Well, I think it's a thing where first off, the administration is different now. It's just different. So Trump garnered so much administration by his just presence online, the way the media covered him. The media just doesn't cover it. I'm not trying to make a political statement here. It just factually, we don't cover politics the way we used to just a few months ago. So you kind of have that as part of it. I turned on last night because I was wanting to watch the online speeches. And so I turned on Fox News and it wasn't there. So I went over to the Asian Squawk Box. And so I was able to find some brief snippets there. But even there, it really wasn't the predominant. They were talking about Myanmar and all this other stuff. And so I was really stunned too that even U.S. and international coverage, that wasn't the headline. I wonder, to your point about the markets, if we have a joint statement or if we don't have a joint statement today, if you might see a sell-off in the market if things kind of come out sour this afternoon. So it'd be curious to watch Friday afternoon sell-off, bad joint statement. You could see that. I think would be the most likely thing at this point.
Well, I do think
if it goes well.
Prior to the summit, I think they announced that there was definitely going to be no joint statement.
Okay,
right?
there's no
so okay. I think they set the tone right there. And so then it really comes out to what our side says about it. And they're going to have a completely different argument on their side. But I actually think no matter what's said, I don't know if the markets are going to move at all. And I just find that really an interesting phenomenon, considering we're probably going into a worse state of the relationship than we've ever been before. And that's not good for business.
Okay. Any final things? I know we're kind of doing this mid-summit, if you will. I think they had 2 sessions last night, 1 today. At the last I've checked, there hasn't been any formal statements. I was looking up Ling Wei and Bill Bishop and trying to look for a kernel here or there. I did see that the report this morning, I believe, that China is moving for a private meeting, or a meeting with Biden on Earth Day in April. And what's funny is I saw Michael Pillsbury predicted that that's what they would do, is they would move for a meeting with Biden, and the hopes would be is that'd be private. So if it's private, they can put more leverage by getting the hawks out the room. You think Biden will do a private meeting with Xi Jinping by April?
I don't. I think Biden's super careful of the optics of that, right? I mean, wasn't that one of the big slams against him was the 20 hours of private meetings he had with Xi and stuff like that? I feel like he's probably, if he does a Xi meeting, it's probably going to be relatively public in some sort of way. I don't know. I mean, the next step is definitely for them to get together, it would seem, although I would argue that there probably needs to be a little more massaging of the relationship prior to that too. So I don't know how that's going to play out. In regards to, trying to track what exactly happened last night, I think probably the best feed is going to be Bill Bishop's comments on his blog today. I'm sure there's going to be some expert that has some update there, but I'm looking right now and I don't really see anything yet. So anyway, we'll see how that plays out. And then let's move from that subject into another one that's super nuanced and shows the insecurity of how China literally has a very difficult needle to thread when it comes to messaging, right? Like, and we've talked about, we go from Alaska, which is massive geopolitically, to a much smaller sort of cultural thread and ramifications, which is the Oscars. China has a Chinese American, Chloe Zhao, who's involved with Nomadland with lots of nominations. She lives in the United States of America. Then there's a Hong Kong film about the Hong Kong protests. And then there's another one from a Taiwanese filmmaker. How China decides to either portray them and present them as China's gift to the world, we're spreading our wings, and what we do is now recognized by the globe, or how they hide those individuals as people that, well, number one, you got this Hong Kong issue. You have Taiwan, which is one country, two systems. You have Chloe, who's decided the last 20 years to live in the United States of America. It's a really interesting nuance, right? And they have to figure out how they portray it to their own people, their populace, their 1.4 billion, because in the case of Chloe, and we talked about it, it's like, oh, go find your success overseas and continue to live overseas because it's better. No, that's not what the message is that they want. They want the Yao Ming message, which is go show you're the best in the world on the global stage and then come back to your homeland because you love it the most.
Yeah. So, I mean, from the Hollywood standpoint, you've kind of brought this up for a while. It maybe break down, okay, for the ignorant folks on this side of the microphone, the different award shows and kind of what they represent and who votes on them. Because you brought the Oscars, so I know that you get the foreign press is involved with one of them. Kind of who's all behind the scenes on some of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to turn people off with with Hollywood stuff, but well, you obviously have the Oscars, which is the big one in movies, and then you have the Golden Globes, which I think people are sort of up in the air about, like, why do we allow several dozen foreign journalists who, by the way, none of them are black or, represent the ethnicities that would show some sort of a diverse group to have so much power in Hollywood. And that's been a discussion for a long period of time. And it seems like they're sort of meeting their maker right now. You have Grammys, which is obviously music. You have Emmys, which is obviously television. But what's interesting too about the Oscars is a lot of times, and we know going back to Richard Gere way back in the early 90s, it's a great platform to make a speech, and there are major human rights issues ongoing inside China that everybody's aware of. And the question is somebody going to take a stand when they take the podium and say something? And then on top of it, if Chloe actually wins, like, what will she actually say? So the Chinese government is downplaying the ability for these streamers to actually broadcast the show live. They want to make sure they have the ability to censor it. And they're actually downplaying the fact that anybody should actually watch the Oscars this year, which is really interesting.
Well, but I'm sitting here wondering, Chris, you've talked about the influence of China on Hollywood. Would Hollywood allow her to win? I mean, would the Oscars allow her to win because they're afraid of what she might say?
Oh, I think my guess is that she probably does win. There's such a huge push well, first of all, I'm seeing Nomadland this weekend finally, but I hear the movie's fantastic, and there's a big push to make sure both genders are represented well in the winner's aisle, and diversity is represented, all that kind of stuff. So that's a very big push. So I think the wind to their back is there. Not that she doesn't deserve it outright, but I'm just saying there is wind to the back. So I don't think anybody's thinking about that in particular. The one entity in Hollywood that is Marvel and Disney, which has the Eternals coming out in November that she directed. And like we talked about before, China is the biggest market outside of US when it comes to anything Marvel, and Marvel is the most valuable entertainment IP in China out of any market.
Yeah. Okay. So the Oscars are April 25th, if I have my dates right there. So you have a little bit of time. I'm, I'm curious to see what happens because, from the general public standpoint, I'm not sure the general public really cares anymore. How I feel it feels like there's always a lecture given by the media, by the Hollywood elite, and I'm not sure that like maybe they shot their wad by constantly lecturing the rest of us. Um, I know from this standpoint, this would be a little bit different because you might have something that, and the CCP would be not wanting to get out there, but could it fall on deaf ears because Hollywood just browbeats the rest of us on all these issues all the time?
Well, that's why I always get nervous. I mean, it used to be really fun to talk about Hollywood with an audience, that was both red and blue. I feel like Hollywood has done a lot of damage in regards to garnering interest from the right side of the aisle, and has been a little over preachy, and they've always have been, but I feel like it's gotten worse. And yeah, I think there is like a turn off of the Oscars and what the messaging is there for a lot of people in the United States of America. And it's something hopefully Hollywood fixes and addresses, because even if you're thinking as a capitalist, there's a lot of people in this country that don't necessarily need to hear what your political point of view is or whatever. They just simply want to be entertained. And Hollywood's great storytelling acumen is if it's at an A+ level, it attracts people of all walks of life to enjoy that content.
Okay, Chris, I'm gonna ask you what else that you want to get to. I know you had something with Cornell, I believe, and one other story. But first, if you're listening to this is a live stream. We have a podcast, same show, Feed the Dragon Podcast. So if you miss any of this, you came in late, you can get download iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you find your podcast at. Feeding the Dragon is all you have to type in and find it. And if you do, a 5-star review would be quite handy. Okay, Mr. Fenton, we have about 4 minutes left. What else did you want to get to today?
Yeah, I thought there were two other stories that were interesting to hit on. We talked about Tesla quite a bit, and our nervousness that Tesla is going to have the same exact thing happen to them that every other company and industry has experienced, which is this idea that, oh yeah, they get great entree into the market, but they got to give a lot of access to their IP and tech and all that other kind of stuff. And then before you know it, there's an imitator in China that's doing the exact same thing. I thought it was interesting to report today that now the PLA and the PAP aren't allowed to actually use Tesla cars anymore because they're afraid that Tesla might be using some sort of big data or surveillance activity on them that's going to get somehow back to the United States of America. I just think that's like a little bit of a tee up of how they're going to justify certain things that they do with Tesla technology, or certain things they might do with SpaceX, which one of my followers mentioned, in regards to saying, oh, you know what? Well, we did that because it was a national security issue or whatever it is. Right. Mm-hmm. And then it also brought up the idea of, wait a minute, whatever happened with our ByteDance TikTok situation?
Mm-hmm.
We never addressed the big data issue there. It just has moved on from the news cycle, and I know my kids continue to use it.
Well, on Tesla, I mean, I've often wondered a lot about Tesla just before the China stuff, but they are, again, this is important to note, the only company that I'm aware of that has its own wholly owned factory in China. China is big into the EV space, and so when you talk about these crackdowns, it doesn't take long. And if you notice, you read the Wall Street Journal's report, they had no comment. Elon Musk, for all of his bravado, I doubt you're going to see a lot of tweets about China. And so the problem, if you go back to what I said earlier about the Quad, is if you can't say anything if you just can't have a meeting and you try to walk around and not really say anything too strong about China, and it doesn't matter, then Tesla will find itself in a spot that they're going to wake up one day and China's going to either take over the factory or make them share IP, or they have stole the IP, or whatever the case is going to be. And Tesla's going to be whining to us in the U.S. going, oh, no. So for me, the standpoint, Chris, is I'm tired of these multinational corporations coming back to the U.S. complaining about what's going on. Well, that worked in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. That dog can't hunt no more. You know the game now. If you're over there, you know the risk. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't take the risk. I'm just saying I will not accept, if it goes bad for Tesla, the whining and complaining about, oh, we didn't know this was coming. Yes, you did. And so for me, that's more of the point is, if it goes bad, if it goes great, good for you. If it goes bad, I will not, I will personally will not take the whining, because we can all see the writing on the wall right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great point. And then, the only other thing I'll bring up before we run out of time is just my alma mater, Cornell University. There was a Washington Free Beacon article, which I know is definitely leans to the right, but the writer and the journalist is actually a Cornell graduate. So he broke a story about how the faculty at Cornell is having real issues with this facility that Cornell has in Beijing with Peking University, and sort of the issues with that influence of China money coming in and what they're trying to get and garner for that kind of access and that kind of financial reward. And I just look at it and I go, God, times have changed, because I actually, as a U.S. Asia Institute trustee, made sure a couple U.S. congressional delegations stopped through there and shook hands with faculty and students. And I was very proud of the fact that Cornell was one of the first universities to actually set up a JV like that in China. But now we're starting to see that there's real issues with these, and how we confront that moving forward is anyone's guess. But I hope we do put American priorities first as we do figure out the right initiatives.
Okay. Once again, you can download the show on a podcast, Feeding the Dragon. Just type that into your favorite podcast browser and it will come up. A 5-star review would be lovely. Barring like the world melting this afternoon, we'll be back next week. But I mean, the news could break and we're like, okay, emergency show. We've got to get out of here and cover this. But we will be back next week, Tuesday or Wednesday, probably. In the meantime, go download the show. Enjoy your weekend. Mr. Fenton, any final words for the listeners? Oh, have you watched the Snyder Cut yet?
I haven't seen it yet. No, and I'm more Marvel than DC. Yeah, I'm more Marvel than DC anyway, so I'm a little bit biased. But yeah, I'll check it out. But anyway, as far as weekend's concerned, have a great Friday, and thank you everybody for listening. Please spread the word about the show and keep the interest in China and U.S. High, because we got big challenges ahead of us.